Hi, and welcome back to our discussion called Fearless. We started last week in looking at the way that we can live in a culture of fear without absorbing that fear, but rather yet actually living in a way that is fearless. I believe there's a strong relationship between being fearless and standing firm on the promises of God. That's why for the next several weeks we're going to be reviewing those promises, some of those promises of God, things that we can stand firm on knowing that there is nothing for us to fear. I hope you agree with me that we're living in times that really try men's souls and try our patience, they try our virtue, they try our ability to keep on keeping on. And that's why we're going to be looking at these lessons. This lesson is actually part two of a two-part promise, or a two-part discussion of a promise that we began looking at last week from Deuteronomy. And we're going to return to that again because I believe this promise is so fundamental to every other promise that God gives us. And in that way, I want to introduce this idea by saying something that may sound a little bit shocking, but I want you to reflect on this, and especially for the next few minutes. I know that you understand deep down inside, and I know that you realize that although so often we push it to the back of our minds, but everyone that you love will eventually leave you. Everyone that you cling to will eventually be separated from you. Now, there are a lot of ways that takes place, and I know that sounds shocking, but deep inside you know it's true. Did you cry when you dropped your child off their first day of school? Why did you cry? Why was there a sense of sadness to watch them walk away and go into that building? Because they were leaving you. When your child took his or her first step, what was your first reaction? First, there's the excitement of my child is beginning to walk. Second is the realization my child is never again going to depend on me as he or she did just moments before. You see, before, for the child to get anywhere, to do anything, you had to carry them. They had to cling to you. Now is the beginning of them leaving. I've often said when a child reaches the age to be able to walk, they begin to leave. When you took your teenager to college for the first time, you helped them unload, you helped them set up their room. Maybe in time of quarantine, you had to just stay there at the car while they went into the dorm and went back and forth to carry things in. What did you feel when it was over? Did you want to linger? Did you want them to linger? Even though we're excited that our children are growing up, even though we're excited that they're going to college to get be able to get an education, to get a career, there's also that side. We know they're never coming back home. Not in the way that they were there before. Now when they come back home, it's to visit us rather than to live there. When your son or daughter got married, or when they get married, what's going to go through your mind? Why do people cry at weddings? And actually, weddings establish a mixture of emotions, joy, excitement, celebration, but sadness. Folks would say to me what we've heard over and over and over, Steve, you're not losing a daughter, you're gaining a son. But the truth was, I used to see her every single day. I wished her well at school. I would see her after school. And now she's taking up a life of her own, a family of her own. Is that the way it should be? Absolutely. That's what makes it bittersweet. But the day we have our children, we understand the day is coming when they will leave. the person that you love the most will leave you one day. Your spouse will leave you, or you will leave your spouse, and you will be alone from that perspective. Some have already experienced that through divorce, where they made vows with someone else for the rest of their lives. Some people make vows for all eternity, only to have them leave. You see, when I'm talking about leaving, it doesn't matter if you're the one who leaves or the one that left behind. There's a cleaving there. You're leaving something. You're being left for something. We don't talk about this a lot, and we deny it a lot because it's painful. But living without the realities that we face can cause us to make choices and decisions that are not good for us. It can also cause us to lose our faith and understanding of the things that God wants us to know through his promises. Look around you. If you're sitting in your living room, who's there with you? As you think about them and as you focus on them, understand each of those eyes, a set of eyes that you're looking at, one of these days, they're going to leave you. One of these days, you will be without them, or they will be without you. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1, David talking to Solomon when he's about to die. As David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Interesting use of words there. I am going the way of all the earth. One of the reasons that I want to talk about this is because it leads right into the discussion that we need to look at to conclude what we were looking at last week. But secondly, because this is the way of all the earth. Folks will leave us, and you know that's true. You've been left by folks. You've been left by people that you went to school with. You've been left by coworkers. You've been left by folks that are very close to you. Some of you have experienced the loss, permanent loss, at least from this life, the way of this earth. Charlotte and I are planning a trip to Pennington, Arkansas. Pennington is the first place that I preached. That's where Charlotte and I met because her family lived in Pennington. It was in that building, that Church of Christ building in Pennington, Arkansas, that we were married. That's where our family began. But that building is closed down. There is no church there anymore. And we're planning a trip to Pennington. And you know what? It may be our last, because there's no one there anymore that we're connected to. We want to go visit the cemetery where her mom and dad are buried, because we haven't been there since her mom passed. Part of the reason we haven't been there is because neither she nor I is a materialist. That's not where our parents are. We know where they are. We know that's the tent they left behind. And we don't tend to cling to those things, but we do want to see their final resting place of that tent. We want to take pictures of that church building where we got married, where I preached for so many years. We want to drive by where Charlotte's house used to be, where I courted her, where I would go visit her after church. The highlight of my week for several years there, that house burned down. For a time after it burned down, we could pass by and we could see the detritus that was left over of things that weren't totally destroyed. You could see the partially burned headboard of a brass bed. But over time, that was even plowed under as the acre they lived on was sold. And all of that area now is farmland. There is no way to demonstrate where that house was. You, like we, have experienced loss. 2 years ago, the building of the high school that I graduated from, Dallas Christian High School, burned to the ground. Friends that I grew up with have followed distant paths that have taken them away from me. family, my extended family, my mom and dad's families, we went separate ways, we separated. Life is about separation. Now, separation is about sin, and separation is also a metaphor for death. And that's part of where the pain comes, because when my daughter was married, when my son was married, and when we celebrated, there was still an understanding that something here has died, and it will never be the same. You'll never hear that back door slam as they come in. You'll never walk into their room to investigate what is it that they're inventing now. All of those things are gone. There's a song that we used to sing, haven't heard it in a while, but the words go like this: beyond this land of parting, losing, and leaving, far beyond the losses darkening this, and far beyond the taking and the bereaving, lies a summer land of bliss. The third verse of that song says, but beyond this land of waiting, seeking, and sighing, far beyond the sorrows darkening this, and far beyond the pain and sickness and dying, lies a summer land of bliss. And then the focus of the song in the chorus is that land of bliss, the land where there is always light and there are no tears, etc. But that first verse, beyond this land of parting, losing, and leaving, in so many ways that describes what life is on this earth. Beyond this land of parting, losing, and leaving. Now this land is other things, but as David said, I'm going the way of all the earth. This is the eventuality. But I want us to cling to this reality in all of that. The passage that we looked at last week from Deuteronomy 31, looking at verse 8, where Moses was talking to Israel. He's about to die. And he's telling them that he's not going to be able to go with them to the promised land. He's leaving them. And he lets them know that he's leaving them with Joshua. And then in the presence of all of the folks, he gives a charge to Joshua. Let's review what that charge says. Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. And I want you to notice how packed this verse is with promise. And the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you, nor forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Now, if we just take that part of that speech that Moses made, there is the basis for us to live fearless lives. That's exactly what Moses said. The summation of it, the end of it is, do not fear or be dismayed. Do not fear or be sad. Do not fear or be afraid. Do not fear or be anxious. Do not fear or be worried. Lift up your countenance. Why? Because the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. And we talked about those last week, about how awesome it is that God is both with us and before us. How awesome it is that no matter what we have to face, God is already in the midst of it, waiting to receive us. Yet he will also accompany us to where he is waiting to receive us. Isn't that an awesome thought? Never alone. Never alone. It's the second part that I want us to focus on today. He will not fail you. He will not forsake you. Therefore, do not fear. Do not be dismayed. Personally, I believe the greatest human fear is abandonment. It's the idea of being left. Maybe you can relate to a time where you couldn't find your parents. I remember a time we were at a mall. We were at a very large, kind of a grocery store. And I wandered away, as sometimes I was wont to do, and I turned back and my parents were gone. And I ran from aisle to aisle to aisle looking for mom and dad. All the time, my panic growing and growing. You know, what a relief it was to finally find them. Although it took someone going on the PA system, but I didn't know, had they gone out into the mall? Had they gone to the car? Have they left me? You know that fear. You know the fear of being abandoned, of being left, of parents leaving us, or anyone else leaving us. I've noticed a theme among those who have gone through adoption, and that theme is, why wasn't I good enough for mom and dad to love me? Because children internalize those things. And I think our greatest fears of being abandoned. That folks that we love are going to leave us, even though we know they will. Now, they're not abandoning us from a desire to abandon us, but sometimes they will. Eventually, they all will. In the rhetoric of divorce, when someone files for divorce, the other person tends to fight hard for the divorce. And it's interesting, there's been research done on this that demonstrates by the time two people get divorced, they tend to equally be ambivalent toward the relationship. They're both tired. They're both frustrated. It's not just one person. But as soon as one person files, then the other person panics in a sense and fights hard to maintain the relationship. And part of the studies have demonstrated that if the relationship makes it through that, it is not unusual at all that within 6 to 8 months, then the other person files for divorce. Because the greatest fear wasn't the divorce, the greatest fear was being left, of being abandoned, of being alone. Whether by intent or by accident or by act of God or whatever, folks leave us. Everyone will leave. And I think that's why it's very difficult for us to believe God's promise that He won't leave us, because we experience it everywhere. Part of it is because we can't see Him here. But part of it is we're so used to being left, or live under the expectation that one day we will be left, even if we're the leaver. There's still the relationship is left. The passage just before the one I read in verse 8, Moses called to Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall give it to them as an inheritance." So at the end of verse 8, he says, don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. The first thing he says to Joshua is, be strong and courageous. Chapter 1 of Joshua, that theme is going to be stated over and over and over again. Joshua, be strong, be courageous. Why? Because of the promise. The thing that keeps us courageous is our faith in the promises of God. Moses called to Joshua and said in the sight of Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn to you." Now, God prohibits us from taking an oath because it's very important and it's very significant, oaths are. Scripture tells us that God makes an oath on His name because there is no name higher. So when He gives us a promise, you can take it to the bank. 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah has run away from Israel. He's run into the wilderness living in a cave. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel I have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thy altars, and killed thy prophets with the sword. And I alone am left." He believes that he was the only one left. And implicit in that is God has even forsaken him. See, he had to run for his life. He didn't believe God could or would save him. And it's interesting what God does, because God has him go and stand on the mountain, and you know the story about how there's a wind that comes by, a strong, mighty wind, rending the mountains and breaking the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After that was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. And in taking very fundamental earth, wind, fire type things, God shows him, I'm not in these things. I am not part of the reality that you believe you live in. I transcend all of this. So he's not in the wind, he's not in the fire, he's not in the earthquake. And God tells him once again, after he demonstrated he wasn't in the fire, there was a gentle blowing. And it came about when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. See, he had retreated back to his cave. Behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And it's interesting. God asked the same question. Elijah gave the same answer. I alone have done this, that, or whatever. I am alone. And God says, here's what you're going to do. And he told him who to go anoint and who to go appoint and all of that. And what began with one person was God's vindication on the Baal prophets and Jezebel and on and on. Look at the promise. God promises, swore an oath that he walks ahead of you. Swore an oath that he will be with you. Swore an oath that he will never fail you. And swore an oath that he will not forsake you. And then he adds, therefore, do not be afraid. Friends and neighbors, brothers and sisters, we need to constantly review the promises of God, almost as mantras, over and over and over. Because the fear that is constantly around us will overwhelm us if we don't remind ourselves, I go before you. I am always with you. I will never fail you. And I will never leave or abandon you. Therefore, don't be afraid. Don't even be dismayed. Fearless. If you feel that God has ever failed you, reflect on that. If you're in a situation or you're going to be in a situation where you feel alone like Elijah, where you feel like God has just turned away from you, when it feels like your prayers are not making it past the ceiling, go to the promises of God and remind yourself, he cannot fail me. It's not that he won't. He cannot fail me. Therefore, if I feel like he has failed me, I don't understand God's ways. My feeling that God has abandoned me or failed me is just a reflection that I don't understand how he works, and therefore I don't understand how he is working. He promised that all things work together for good. He didn't promise they're all good. He promised that good will come out of them. He promised that everything will work toward your good and my good. I have to remind myself of that. I have to remind myself that God cannot fail me. Therefore, if it feels like he's failing me, I must remind myself he can't, and my feelings are wrong simply because I don't understand right now how he's moving. But I know he's moving because he said he is, and he cannot lie. Now, later, as I'm looking through the rear view mirror of providence, I will see it. I will see how he was moving, just like the poem Footprints. In the meantime, I'm going to remind myself God will never fail me. And we may need to do that over and over and over. In our toughest time, God will never fail me. 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 God will never leave me. God will never abandon me. God will never fail me. God will never leave me. God will never abandon me. God will never fail me. So I need not be afraid, regardless of what it is. I can see this from my past, and I know you can too. The concept of prayers that God answered no, when you prayed your guts out, no, He answered. And now you understand why. And now you're able to thank Him for that answer. Brothers and sisters, when we feel abandoned by God, it's because we don't understand how He works. We don't need to trust that He is working, that He cannot not work in our lives. He cannot not fulfill His promises. Remember the promises. Deuteronomy 31 verse 8, and the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. You know, I think sometimes we look at life of the things that impact us, and sometimes we're overwhelmed, or we think we're overwhelmed, even though another promise, He'll never allow us to be overwhelmed. But I think there are times that we feel like, man, God, you've just opened, you opened the gate, man, everything's running out. The promise that God goes ahead of you means nothing comes to you except by His grace or by His permission. If you think of all the fiery darts that Satan is constantly firing at you that are extinguished by God who walks ahead of you, and there's some that He says, all right, I'm going to let this one go through because this is going to make him stronger. This is going to teach him. This is going to help him. And he may not understand it when he gets hit by the dart, but he's going to understand it because I'm going to empower him through that. We pray that God takes things away from us, and often how He answers the prayer, I believe usually, is not to take things away from us, but to empower us to overcome them by His word and by His promise. Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth. Brothers and sisters, the folks around you are going to leave you someday. Your spouse is going to leave you someday. The relationships that we've enjoyed on this earth are going to leave this earth. Ultimately, it's going to be you and God. Ultimately, it's going to be a God that can never leave you, even in the grave. A God that can never abandon you. And you see, that's attitude. Leaving is just proximity. Abandonment is an attitude. And God cannot abandon His people. And He won't if He could. Now behold, today I'm going the way of all the earth. This is life. Charlotte and I have been working on getting together our final wishes. We've been working on that because when I had to go through with my brother and sister everything that it took to put my dad's accounts in order and to take care of Mom. And if you remember, when my dad passed, my mom had fallen and broken her hip, and she was in the hospital, and we were trying to take care of final arrangements, deal with her, all of those kinds of things. And by the power and strength of God, we did. But going through that experience, Charlotte and I said, not long after that and several times, you know, I don't want our kids to have to go through this. So one of the things that we've been doing, and particularly lately, is writing down, putting together our papers, putting together our documents, explaining to our kids where they are, where to find a key to the house, you know, when we're gone, all of those kinds of things. But it also has dealt with writing out our final wishes. What do I want to happen to my tent when I'm no longer in it? And I'm telling you that going through this process has been very healing. It's been very peace creating, because it's helping us to face not just the demise of those around us, but our own. To help us understand that we too are going, relatively soon, are going to be going the way of the earth. The way of all the earth. And it's not wrong. It's not bad. It's not something we need to avoid. And in fact, as we prepare for that, we look to eternity that much more. As we prepare for the fact that this tent is going to fail one day and somebody's going to have to deal with this tent and the things that we've left behind, it is not bad to focus on those things, because in doing that, you focus on, why am I choosing to do this? Why are we wanting it this way? And it all comes down to because of our hope, because of our belief in the promises of God. And one of those promises is, He will not abandon us to a grave. Brothers and sisters, if we just from this passage, if we didn't have any other promises in Scripture, I go ahead of you, I will be with you, I can never fail you, and I will never abandon you. Therefore, do not fear. If we truly believe those, and I mean to the extent of the size of a grain of mustard seed, if we had that much belief, whoa, what we could accomplish. Whoa, the security we can have. Whoa, the peace we can have. When we understand that everything is happening, is going the way of this earth. And that's not wrong. And it's not bad if you stand on the promises of God. Fearless. Absolutely fearless. Not reckless, not stupid. Fearless. So while the earth is shaking around us, while it looks like an earthquake is destroying the economy, is destroying our bodies, while nothing seems to be able to be trusted, can't trust our government, can't trust the economy, can't trust on and on and on and on, all the things that tend to make us afraid. If we truly believe these 4 promises, fearless, because we've got to remember them again every single day. Because it's like I told you before, leaving, separation, is really a metaphor for death. So is sleep. Jesus used it that way when He talked about Lazarus being asleep. Right now, you're reflecting on the promises of God, and right now, you're feeling bolder, and that's great. And tonight, you're going to go to bed, and you're going to go to sleep, and you're going to be separated from this discussion. And you're going to be separated from remembering those promises, because you won't be remembering anything. And tomorrow, if you wake up, you will be separated from those promises unless you revisit them. And I would encourage you, revisit them several times a day. Revisit them over and over and over. Let them be a mantra until the fear is gone. If the anxiety is still there, you haven't repeated them enough. Repeat them and repeat them and repeat them until they become second nature, and that becomes the normal way for us to respond. He's fearless because he can't leave us. He can't abandon us. He's always with us, and he'll always go before us. You feel bold? I hope so. Do you feel fearless? I hope so. Are you feeling any anxiety or fear? I hope not. But if so, you're forgetting that you don't understand the way God works. But you will. He will show it to you. If you need to be reminded before you can see it in your rear mirror, go to the Old Testament and read the stories of the promises and read how God delivered people from the most horrible situations because he couldn't abandon them even when it looked like there was no hope. And be reminded, God fulfills his promises. That's worth living for fearlessly, and that's worth dying for fearlessly. God's with you right now. God's with me right now. Praise his name. Be fearless. Be courageous. And do not ever be dismayed. Have a powerful day. Have a powerful tomorrow. But start it with the promises. Start it with the assurance. And then spend the rest of the day absolutely fearlessly. God bless you. I love you. And I love this faith that we have in common, because you're such an encouragement to me to be fearless. See you soon.